Do you know Maud Flanders has come back to life? What about the fact that Bart is afraid of horses despite being a champion jockey? Or the fact that many babies keep aging but Maggie keeps staying the same, even though she's older than them? These are just a few of many inconsistencies in The Simpsons. The Simpsons is one of the longest running shows in television history.
When the very first episode aired in 1989, the viewers agreed on one thing. It wasn't as funny as it used to be.
The only shows that have been going longer than them are some game shows, soap operas, and the news. Which I think the news barely counts, but they're still on the list. So after running for 36 plus years, The Simpsons have had numerous inconsistencies with their lore. From just little gags and jokes that contradict other jokes, to plot devices that just screw up their established history. And in this video, I'll be going over what I find to be the most interesting ones, because going over all of them would take way too long. So let's talk about the many inconsistencies of The Simpsons. But before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to our patrons. If you like our content and want to support us, consider becoming a patron, where you get access to all our videos 1 week early. If not, a like and subscribe goes a long way. Thank you. The first thing I want to talk about is Springfield, which is easily the most constantly changing thing on the show, with buildings and locations changing from seemingly joke to joke. I think one of the most well-known ones is from the Stonecutters episode, where they say the nuclear power plant is right next to the Simpsons house, which was only ever in this episode. More often than not, the power plant is generally off by itself, not really close to anything, with a lake nearby. And usually there are other houses behind the Simpsons house. Except for the time where they moved the Springfield cemetery behind their house, which again was only for one episode. Much like the house George Bush moved into, which is directly across the street from the Simpsons, but it's never been seen again. However, I will say it's in the game Simpsons Road Rage. They also say it's in Hit and Run, but I question that. And speaking of the neighbors of the Simpsons, let's talk about the brown house next door. Most people remember this as Ruth Power's house, a woman that got a predominant role in 2 episodes before just being a background character. In one of the later seasons, she talks about how she's been their neighbor for a long time.
You haven't stopped by to say hello in 25 years, and I live next door.
But if this was the case, why did Sideshow Bob move in next door? Ruth Powers never moved away, and Sideshow Bob didn't move in with her, so what happened here? Now, let's talk about another part of town, where they say the church is right next to Moe's, which was shown in the Simpsons movie, but this was only ever shown in the movie, and never shown on the show. Heck, they don't even have Moe's next to the church later in the movie. The church typically doesn't really have a neighbor, more commonly surrounded by trees or a parking lot, in what looks like the residential area of Springfield, while Moe's is more commonly in the commercial district of Springfield, with more often than not a parking lot next to it. It also once had a playground for babies. But in almost every depiction, King Tut's music store is next to Moe's on the other side. So those are the ones that stood out to me for the inconsistency of Springfield. But there are many, many more inconsistencies in this town. If you're interested, some people try to logically put everything on the show into one large map of Springfield. I'll put a link into the description if you want to check it out. So we talked about the locations of The Simpsons. Now let's talk about the timeline. Obviously, with the show being over 30 years old and the family not aging, there were going to be many problems with the timeline, which is explained as a floating timeline, where time changes but people don't age. So as time passes, the show can still be relevant, and not stuck in the 90s, despite the fact they still make jokes about the 80s. However, this floating timeline really doesn't explain how Maggie has had 2 birthdays despite being 1. Bart has had 3 birthdays, and Lisa has had like 5. And Homer has gone from 38 to 42. Also, Marge celebrated her 34th birthday on the show, but at this time they say Homer was 38. Yet they were both seniors in high school together, and they never said Marge skipped 4 years of school. Even though the floating timeline can explain things, it's still fun to point out these issues. Like how Homer and Marge went on a date to see Empire Strikes Back, when it was at Feelers in 1980, and graduated high school in the 70s, but we have them as young adults in that 90s episode. Or how Bart watched SpongeBob as a toddler, which debuted 10 years after The Simpsons.
I've always loved cartoons, going way back to the real early SpongeBobs.
But now, how about we talk about the times the show has been in the face of this floating timeline, where characters, mostly babies, have aged, despite the fact Maggie is older than them and has never aged. The obvious example of this is the octuplets, where Maggie was clearly around before them and was present at their birth, but now the octuplets come off like they're older than her. They can talk, they can walk, they can lock Bart in a prison cell.
Mommy, will you let Daddy come back cookie?
But this is far less egregious than what they did with Ling Bouvier, Selma's daughter, who is shown as the same age as Maggie, a 1-year-old, but all of a sudden, she's a freaking toddler. What the hell is this? And then of course we have Gino, the son of Sideshow Bob, who Bob had with a woman after escaping prison and moving to Italy. This kid is also a toddler that can just full on talk and walk, despite the fact that Maggie was around before Bob ever went to prison. And last but not least, we have the only non-baby, Mary Spuckler. When we first see her, she looks to be the same age as Bart, but in her next appearance, she is much older. In another episode, they say Mary is 13, 3 years older than Bart. Yeah, because this is clearly a 13-year-old. Oh yeah, and then there's Kearney, which is just a complete mess of a timeline. So I'm not going to get into that one. But the Real Jim's made a video about it, if you were interested in the history of Kearney. Now, I want to briefly talk about the inconsistency that inspired this video, and that is Bart and horses. What do you think of when I say Bart and horses? Lisa's pony, obviously. When the hell did Bart have a horse? But no. More likely than not, you think about when Bart was a championship-winning jockey with his horse, Duncan, or Furious D, that the Simpsons rescued from a sideshow attraction, where it was being forced to jump from a high dive into a pool. Bart loved this horse. And yet, in a later episode, Superintendent Chalmers asks if he ever seen a horse before, which Bart says no. And then in another episode, Bart says he's horribly afraid of horses. What the hell happened here? He's a champion jockey. How has he never seen a horse and is afraid of them? So yeah, this ridiculousness made me want to look into other ridiculous inconsistencies in the show. Now let's talk about characters coming back to life. Of course, everyone remembers Maud Flanders dying. But did you know that 9 seasons after that happened, Maud is alive again? In this crowd shot right here. Welcome back, Maud. Another character that died on the show was Mrs. Glick. You might remember her as the old lady that forced Bart to do yard work until he was bleeding and only gave him a nickel in return. But don't worry, Bart got his revenge because he kills her. I'm actually not even joking, he kills her. Mrs. Glick died because of a pet robot seal that he and Martin made. And it's not even an implied death. They reported it on the news. But don't worry, she has been seen up and about Springfield numerous times after her death. Then of course we have Fat Tony, who died of a heart attack. And if you didn't know that, spoilers, I guess? Don't worry, he was just replaced by his cousin Fit Tony, who just becomes Fat Tony. But after the original Fat Tony's death, he is seen alive again in the Bowlerama, bowling for the mob's team in a tournament. Now, you could just say, oh, that was clearly Fit Tony. But no, you'd be wrong. Fit Tony is on another team in this same episode, Selma's exes, because he married Selma after Fat Tony died. And lastly, we have Dr. Marvin Monroe, which is more of a retcon, but I'm counting it. Multiple times the show says that he died, even having things named after him in memoriam.
Attention all units, Homer Simpson has been sighted. Proceeded once to Marvin Monroe Memorial Hospital.
But he shows up in a later season saying he was just sick.
Dr. Marvin Monroe? I haven't seen you in years.
Oh, I've been very sick.
You think he would have said something earlier when people were making things in his memory. Now let's talk about the less fun inconsistencies. Obviously, we have Armin Tamzarian, aka Seymour Skinner, because he was a fraud this whole time, despite the fact we see Skinner as a child in later seasons. and have seen his father, Sheldon Skinner, who looks just like Seymour. Then we have Carl Carlson, who the show says was adopted and grew up in Iceland to a white couple, despite the fact they have talked about Carl's dad and has shown his sister. And we have seen him numerous times in his youth in Springfield, being friends with Homer and Lenny. Yet, Carl says they were never friends, despite he's known them his whole life. What a dick. Screw you, Carl. I mean, Lenny literally carved out a freaking mountain for you. Jerkass. And with those out of the way, I'm gonna close out the video with a lightning round of little inconsistencies. Apu says he has a PhD, but later claims to be a college dropout. Chief Wiggum was a security guard when Mona left Homer, but he is shown to be Homer's age in another flashback. Smithers is said to be 25 years old, which is just complete bullcrap by itself. But he's shown to be in high school with Homer and Marge, making him way older. Mr. Burns grew up as a poor child, before a billionaire offered him to live with them. But we see Burns' parents are rich later on. Ned Flanders was sent to Dr. Foster as a child, 30 years ago. But Ned said he was 60 years old.
I suppose if you must know, I'm 60.
Marge has said her necklace was a family heirloom, but later says it was given to her by Homer. But she also has a drawer full of them. Marge gave away Homer's bowling shirt, which is later worn by John in Homer's Phobia. But his shirt was ripped apart by Mr. Burns' hounds at the end of the bowling episode. And lastly, in the episode where Ned and Edna start dating, they say they have never met before and introduce themselves to each other.
You know, I don't believe we've ever been formally introduced.
Despite the fact, they have actually been on a date before after Maude died. And that, my friends, is just some of the many inconsistencies of The Simpsons. Of course, there are a plethora of more in the show. If you know of some that I didn't mention, let me know about them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.